Have you ever had that weird feeling where a memory you were sure was gone just pops back into your head super clear? Or maybe the opposite happens. You're racking your brain for something important. You know it's in there somewhere, but nothing. It's just blank. It's definitely way more complicated than just having a quote-unquote bad memory. There's this whole fascinating process behind why our brains ditch some things and cling on to others. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into the mystery of forgotten memories. Our mission basically is to unpack the science. Why do our brains forget? Are those memories really gone forever or just locked away? And maybe a bit unsettlingly, what role do new technologies play? Could they retrieve or maybe even manipulate memories? We've gathered insights from, neuroscience papers, psychology studies, and even explorations into the ethics of messing with memory.
Yeah, and it's a journey that really pushes against what we normally think. Most of us see forgetting as like a glitch, a mistake in the system. But the science, it's starting to paint a different picture. Forgetting isn't always a bug. Often it's an active feature, something our brain does on purpose. It's adaptive.
Okay, let's unpack that. Forgetting is a feature. When most people think about forgetting, they probably think of Hermann Ebbinghaus, right? The guy with the forgetting curve. He did those famous experiments back in the 19th century, used himself as the subject, memorizing lists of nonsense syllables, stuff like ZOF or VUM, and then he timed how long it took him to relearn them. His big takeaways were, 1, we forget a lot really fast, right after learning, and 2, that initial rapid forgetting slows down. It levels off eventually.
Exactly. Ebbinghaus really laid the groundwork for what we call trace decay theory. The basic idea is that memories, especially the short-term ones, just fade. Like the physical or chemical traces in the brain just sort of dissipate over time if you don't use them. Think seconds or minutes for brand new stuff. But, there are things that don't quite fit. How come you can hop on a bike after 20 years and just ride?
Right. Or those super vivid flashbulb memories, like everyone remembers exactly where they were on 9/11.
Precisely. Those seem to defy simple fading, and there's even research suggesting sleep might play a role in stopping that decay, almost like hitting pause on the fading process.
Okay, so some memories fade, like old photos. But what about when you knew something and it's just poof, gone? Is it really just faded, or is the brain doing something more deliberate?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. Because, yes, the brain can actively forget. There's this concept called active forgetting. The technical definition is something like an internal process that functions to foster retention loss by altering a memory state or that of pathways to it. Basically, its job is to solve the memory adaptation problem.
Memory adaptation problem.
Yeah, it's the need to dial back access to memories when having them constantly available actually messes with what you're trying to do, cognitively or emotionally. Think of it like your brain tidying up, tuning memory to help you out right now.
Okay, so decluttering the mental attic. How does it do that?
There are a few key mechanisms. One is memory inhibition, often seen in something called retrieval-induced forgetting, or RIF. What's fascinating about RIF is its retrieval specificity. It means the very act of trying hard to remember one specific thing can make related competing information harder to recall later.
So it's not just studying, it's the pulling it out of memory.
Exactly. The act of retrieval is key. It promotes forgetting the competitors. It's interference dependent, meaning it kicks in when distracting memories pop up while you're trying to remember something else. Even failing to remember something can trigger this inhibition of other related stuff. So the brain isn't just ignoring, it's actively suppressing to help you focus.
Interesting.
And then there's process inhibition. We see this in experiments using directed forgetting instructions. You show someone a list of items, and after each one, you tell them either remember or forget. Later, guess what? People recall significantly fewer of the items they were told to forget.
So we can actually tell our brains not to store something.
It suggests we can, yeah. Strategically inhibit encoding, possibly by telling the hippocampus, that key memory hub, to kind of dial it down. And these active processes involve brain regions like the prefrontal cortex for control and the hippocampus. Even brain chemistry, like the neurotransmitter GABA, plays a role in this inhibitory control.
Wow, okay, so the brain isn't just leaky, it has the delete key, or maybe a hide function. It's actively managing data to keep us running smoothly. But if the brain is hiding things away, what does that mean for memories we think are gone? Are they truly deleted or just inaccessible, waiting? And this is where we get into the idea of engrams, right? The physical traces of memory.
Exactly. Engrams are the hypothetical physical changes in neurons, synapses, molecules that represent a stored memory. Our sense of self, our synaptic self, is thought to be built on these complex structures holding our experiences.
So are these engrams erased or just hidden?
Well, the dominant view now is that memories often aren't truly gone, but maybe inaccessible, or, and this is crucial, modifiable. This leads us to a reconsolidation.
Reconsolidation, what's that?
Okay, so when you retrieve a memory that's already been stored or consolidated, it doesn't just pop up perfectly. It becomes temporarily fragile, unstable. It needs to be restabilized or reconsolidated to be stored again. Think of it like taking a file out of a cabinet. While it's out, you could smudge it, add a note, even tear a page.
So retrieving a memory puts it at risk.
In a way, yes, but it also makes it adaptable. For it to be put back securely, it often requires new processes, like building new proteins. We know, for example, that fear memories need new protein synthesis in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, to reconsolidate after you recall them.
That's wild. So simply remembering something can actually change the memory itself. That feels like a real double-edged sword.
It absolutely is. This temporary instability opens a crucial window for modification and updating. Now, sometimes that's good. It's how we get the testing effect. Actively retrieving information makes the memory stronger. Retrieval practice helps you learn.
Okay, that makes sense.
But there's the other edge of the sword, misinformation. Experiments using the misinformation paradigm show this clearly. If you expose someone to misleading information after they formed a memory and then ask them to recall the original event,
They mix it up.
they can, yeah. The retrieval practice can actually enhance the encoding of the misinformation. This is a huge issue for things like eyewitness testimony, making people susceptible to false details they later swear they saw. And it goes even further. Research shows false memories can be actively created.
Like completely fabricated memories.
Yes. Studies have implanted false memories right into the hippocampus in animal models, and you have classic human studies, like those by Elizabeth Loftus, where participants were convincingly led to believe they got lost in a shopping mall as a child, something that never happened.
Wow.
Or even creating false memories of taking a hot air balloon ride, which then actually changed people's preferences about such activities. Often, this involves reactivating real memory traces from the past and then skillfully weaving in false information, creating a new narrative that feels totally genuine to the person. You can even flip the emotional tag, the valence of a memory, making a bad memory seem good, or vice versa.
The idea that our memories are that malleable, that easily changed or even created is frankly a bit mind-bending. And it leads us straight into a really sensitive topic. Repressed memories, especially around trauma. How does all this fit with that idea?
Ah, yes, the so-called memory wars. It's a very contentious area in psychology. The core idea of repressed memories is that extremely traumatic experiences can be unconsciously blocked, sometimes for years, and then later recovered, often in therapy. Freud introduced this concept and initially used things like hypnosis, but even he later became skeptical, finding many recovered memories were actually false.
So what's the current thinking among researchers?
Well, there's significant skepticism now, largely fueled by documented cases where false memories were created, sometimes unintentionally, in therapy settings using techniques like guided imagery or hypnosis that can be highly suggestive. It's important to look at other explanations impartially. Someone might not talk about trauma simply because they don't want to. Or there's the forget it all along effect, forgetting you ever told someone about the trauma. Sometimes an event might only be reinterpreted as traumatic much later in life.
So the idea of trauma being actively pushed down and hidden isn't the main explanation.
Generally, no. A lot of research actually shows traumatic events are often remembered very vividly, sometimes intrusively, like in PTSD. They're usually not forgotten or repressed in the Freudian sense. For memories that do feel hidden, some research suggests accessing them might involve recreating the brain state from when they were encoded. Think about the balance of excitatory chemicals like glutamate, which surges during stress, and inhibitory ones like GABA.
Okay, so memory isn't a recording. It's alive. It's reconstructive. Always changing, sometimes being actively pruned, which brings up a huge question. If memories are this changeable, what about technologies trying to access them, retrieve them, or even erase them? Let's dive into that cutting edge now. How are new technologies trying to get inside our heads and interact with memory?
One major area is brain stimulation. Techniques like deep brain stimulation, or DBS, where electrodes are implanted deep in the brain. They've targeted memory circuits like the connections between the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus. The results are complex.
How so?
While stimulating these areas doesn't just universally boost memory, it seems timing is critical. If the stimulation hits when the memory network is already working well, it can actually worsen memory performance.
Oh, that's counterintuitive.
Right. But if the stimulation arrives when the network is functioning poorly, memory can be significantly improved. So there's potential for real gains, maybe for conditions like Alzheimer's, but it's definitely not a simple on switch. It needs a lot more refinement to be a reliable therapy.
Okay, what else?
Another really interesting avenue is targeted memory reactivation during sleep. We know sleep is crucial for memory consolidation, maybe even for pruning unnecessary connections, systematically removing some aspects. So researchers are trying to piggyback on this. They try to improve recall by subtly cueing memories during specific sleep stages.
How to cue them.
For example, if you learn to associate a particular sound with an object earlier, they might play that sound softly while you're asleep. Some studies show this can reduce errors when you recall the information shortly after waking up. But the effect seems to fade. People still forget over longer periods, so it's not quite a magic bullet for stopping forgetting altogether.
Fascinating, though. But what about the flip side? Not strengthening, but erasing memories, especially traumatic ones. Is that feasible?
That's a huge focus, especially for disorders like PTSD. The research is zeroing in on the brain's fear circuits. Key players are the amygdala, the fear hub, and parts of the prefrontal cortex that help regulate it. By understanding how these areas talk to each other, scientists are figuring out ways to essentially weaken those fear memory connections. Using techniques like optogenetics in animal models, they can induce long-term depression, a weakening of synaptic connections in pathways linked to fear.
Weakening the connections dampens the fear.
That's the idea. It seems to reduce the persistence of the fear memory and make it easier to extinguish the fear response. In humans, using different methods like post-retrieval extinction, basically, reactivating the memory, then undergoing extinction therapy, they see evidence of a dampened connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. This suggests changing that circuit's plasticity is key to reducing the fear. There are also early-stage efforts looking at molecular memory modifications, directly targeting the specific molecules involved in locking down a memory.
Okay, weakening or erasing seems potentially therapeutic. But what about the sci-fi scenario? Extracting a memory, reading someone's mind.
Well, the principle is sort of there. If memories are physically encoded in the brain structure, then theoretically, if you could map and replicate that structure perfectly, you might replicate the memory.
But that sounds incredibly difficult.
Understatement of the century. The sheer complexity and the colossal amount of work are astronomical. To give you a sense of scale, some estimates simulating just a mouse brain would require something like the entire planet's current computing power. For intact human brains, using hypothetical future tech like nanorobots, we're talking many decades, probably many centuries.
So not anytime soon. What about AI? Can AI help read brain activity?
AI is definitely part of the picture. The idea is to train AI models on patterns of neural activity, say from fMRI or EEG scans while someone is thinking about or seeing something. The AI learns to correlate the brain patterns with the stimuli. Then you could potentially show the AI new brain patterns and have it try to reconstruct what the person is experiencing. Machine learning algorithms are used for this, but current prototypes, they can maybe reconstruct a barely recognizable shape.
And there's a bigger problem, right?
A huge one. The ground truth is truly disputed and cannot be known or otherwise corroborated. We can see brain activity, but we can't know definitively what the internal experience, the actual memory is for that person to check if the AI got it right.
Which brings us crashing into the really big questions about ethics and who we are. If we can start modulating memories or even detecting them, what does that mean?
Exactly. The ethical implications of memory modulating technologies, MMTs, are vast and, frankly, quite daunting. First, there are identity harms. Our sense of self is woven from our memories, our life narrative. If you change those memories, you risk disrupting the coherence of self-narratives, impacting authenticity. Think of the example Claude. If an MMT side effect caused partial loss of identity, maybe he suddenly changed careers drastically from charity work to finance, but couldn't understand why his values seemed to have shifted so much. It creates deep personal conflict.
Yeah, that's unsettling.
Then there's moral responsibility. If you can dampen the emotional impact of a memory, say guilt or empathy, does that change someone's moral compass? How do we assign responsibility maybe between a victim and perpetrator if their memories of an event are altered?
Difficult questions.
Absolutely. And zooming out, what about societal impact? Could MMTs worsen socioeconomic barriers, creating a world where only the rich can afford to enhance memories or erase trauma, and the really chilling prospect, memory and eventually personhood, becoming just another data set for companies to mine and profit from?
And the legal system. You mentioned memory detection.
Right. Legal concerns are huge. The idea of memory detection using fMRI or EEG P300 signals to see if someone recognizes crime scene details, for instance, is forensically appealing. The assumption is brain signals are less under conscious control than saying, I don't remember.
But it's not that simple.
Far from it. There are major methodological challenges. EEG data is noisy. You need lots of trials. Designing the test itself relies on assumptions about what stimuli are truly incriminating. Plus, it's vulnerable to countermeasures. People might be able to deliberately use mental tricks to try and beat the test. And often, the algorithms used are complex machine learning models, a black box problem. It's hard to explain exactly how the algorithm decides someone recognizes something beyond it seems to work in tests. Validating these tests is incredibly difficult when the ground truth, whether the person actually has the memory, can't be independently confirmed.
So using it in court is problematic.
Highly problematic. It raises fundamental questions about the jury's role. Are they still the lie detector, or does this technology usurp that? Does it unfairly impinge upon the credibility of the witness, or even abrogate the jury's function? It's a legal and ethical minefield.
Wow. Okay, we have journeyed a long way. From Ebbinghaus simply timing himself forgetting nonsense syllables, to the idea that our brain actively chooses to forget, to the fact that memories aren't fixed recordings but are constantly being reshaped. And now we're on the verge of technologies that might let us deliberately enhance, erase, or even detect these fluid things we call memories. The potential is huge, but the ethical tightropes are just staggering.
They really are. I think understanding memory forces us to look not just at what we recall, but crucially at what we forget, why we forget, and what it means when we start gaining the power to control that process. And it leaves us with a really provocative thought. If our own stories, our personal narratives, are constantly being subtly rewritten by our brains, and maybe soon by technology too, what does it even mean to truly know ourselves as we move into the future?
A profound question indeed. Something for all of us to think about. We hope this deep dive has maybe shifted how you think about your own mind and the amazing, intricate, and sometimes downright weird world of memory.